welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 316. And on this episode of the podcast, I am talking about the media coverage towards basketball player Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark with Iowa took over the basketball world, hitting the most free-pointers in women's college basketball history with 548, and is the all-time leader in points with 3,951, and points per game with 28.4. She was the obvious number one draft pick in the WNBA draft going to the Indiana Fever, and since joining the WNBA, all the talk is about other things other than her play. First, it was the talk about hard fouls and how others in the WNBA talk about her, leading to others talking about resentment about the fact that Clark is viewed as the savior of women's basketball. And now we've reached another breaking point with her being left off of Team USA in the upcoming Olympics. And I'm personally not interested in giving my takes on the situation. It's the coverage around it that bothers me, specifically two key figures in today's modern sports media, Stephen A. Smith and Pat McAfee, who give their opinions on everything. And that's fine when we are talking about the NBA and the NFL, because that's where these two have a history of giving sometimes good opinions on. But them giving strong opinions on Caitlin Clark feels like them just trying to ride a wave to remain relevant. And I am someone who only likes to talk about things I follow and care about. And maybe this is harsh, but I think many of the men giving takes on this situation do not care about the future or current WNBA. They only care about giving their hot take and to get into an argument that's going to go viral. Stephen A. Smith, for instance, this past week has gotten into bouts with female analyst Monica McNutt and Andrea Carter, and I feel bad watching them argue with him because they are acting rational and logical, but he is winning because they are giving him exactly what he wants, to be in a conversation about a hot button issue. Stephen A. Smith has absolutely no desire to be in a rational conversation or a nuanced conversation about the WNBA. It's about getting views. And when you're having those kind of conversations about things you know nothing about, that's when I become disturbed about it. And that's where I am with the Stephen A. Smith of it all. I'm disturbed about the current state of ESPN, that this guy is acting like he is making Monica McNutt a star, that he is making Andrea Carter a star, that he is the face of ESPN. And maybe Stephen A. Smith is the face of ESPN, but it's annoying how not humble he is about it. He's so arrogant about it. And I was starting to feel weird about Stephen A. Smith when Max Kellerman departed and he said, I don't want to work with this guy. I think maybe ESPN has given this guy too big of a platform. They have told him, we want your opinion on everything. And the bad thing is, people's opinions about everything is too much because he doesn't have a nuanced opinion about the WNBA. I'm just as bothered at ESPN for giving him this platform than I am for Stephen A. Smith spouting these sometimes ridiculous takes about these issues. And I'm not innocent in all this as a viewer. I have been a spectator towards the first take of it all for years now. I've watched Skip Bayless when he was at the helm of it. I've watched Stephen A. Smith. I've somewhat created the monster that exists today because I, like many men who watch sports, wants to watch sports 24 hours a day, and this is what you get when you watch sports 24/7 a day. You get these ridiculous shows that have to give you content and they have to get into arguments. The embrace debate of it all needs to end, and I feel like we're getting to a breaking point with the embrace debate. It was fun when we were debating things like who's the all-time home run king or is LeBron better than Michael Jordan, but the debate around Caitlin Clark is just awkward because nobody is giving an interesting and insightful take on it. They're just trying to insert themselves into the moment, and that's what I feel like Stephen A. Smith is doing right now. He is trying to insert himself into the moment because he wants to be just as famous as Caitlin Clark. And then you have Pat McAfee, who has been like an insane storm since joining ESPN. And I have watched Pat McAfee, and I have enjoyed it in the past. I think he gives zany interviews. I think athletes like to talk to him. I think in this instance with Caitlin Clark, he was trying to defend her, but the whole thing again just felt like he wanted to become the center of this issue. And that's the thing is, McAfee and Smith are both after the same thing. They are trying to both be the centers of attention. So that's why they are navigating towards Caitlin Clark, and they're not even interested in the sports aspect of it all, which is the point of sports talk, is to talk about the game itself. They're never talking about Caitlin Clark's development as a player or how she could be the next Steph Curry. They're talking about these hot button issues. It's ESPN, for crying out loud. I mean, I hate to say stick to sports, but when you're talking about an athlete like Caitlin Clark, that's when you should stick to sports. You should talk about the sport that she is playing and her as a player. I'll give you an example of this. I love the show Get Up on ESPN. I love Mike Greenberg. I think he's one of the best sportscasters of all time, but he really got on my nerve the other day when he said this. They were going to talk about the Caitlin Clark situation and how a WNBA player was tweeting about her, and he said, I would love to talk about other WNBA topics, but I gotta get into this one. And that feels so disingenuous, because you don't want to get into another topic. You are loving the Caitlin Clark storm, and I'm not just saying it's not just Mike Greenberg. I don't want to go against him. It's not just Stephen A. Smith. It's not just Pat McAfee. It's every male sportscaster. They love what is going on, and that's something I hate most of all, is how much they are loving this conversation. A guy like Bomani Jones, who I occasionally likes, he loves that this is the center of the sports world right now, so he can get into other topics that have nothing to do with Caitlin Clark. Like, she is like the missile that is launching all of these sports conversations. If you even want to talk about that, they are using her to talk about the culture. I personally don't feel educated enough to talk about how the WNBA itself is treating Caitlin Clark, but here's how I feel as an outsider. I look at the WNBA and Clark and I think this: they should do everything to grow Clark's star power. That's what the NBA has, star power. Look at how the NBA markets new stars. Victor Wembanyama last year with the Spurs. That's how you should treat a phenom. You should show them some respect. You should respect their game, and you should know that they're not going to come out of the gates being the best basketball player of all time. Like, I just feel like some of them are talking about Caitlin Clark's plays early on in this WNBA season, and they go, oh, she doesn't have it. She doesn't deserve all the hype she's getting yet. You don't have to dissect every game. You should give her time to grow and develop as a basketball player, especially in a rookie season. Like, can we at least get to the All-Star game before you're talking about how Caitlin Clark is playing in the WNBA? Like, give her some time, but they don't want to give her time because of all of the attention she is getting. But I feel like NBA fans gave Victor Wembanyama time, and by the second half of the season, he was playing like one of the best big men in the entire NBA, and that exact same thing could happen for Caitlin Clark in the WNBA. At some point, she is going to look like the Caitlin Clark who was in Iowa, and that's going to be a scary thing for all of these people when they have to start talking about her as a basketball player again instead of a topical issue. And that's why I think so many of them, the Bomani Joneses, the Stephen A. Smiths, the Pat McAfees, they are taking advantage of this moment where she doesn't look like the Caitlin Clark from college so that they can get in all of these hot button issues. But when she starts playing crazy, when she starts averaging 35 points a game, you will never hear from them again. And that's my big takeaway. When she does start to play better than everyone else, they're going to cease talking about her. It's a double standard they are doing. They're not going to talk about the good. They're only going to talk about the bad. And it really hasn't even been bad on her end. I think Clark herself deserves all the credit in the world for how she's dealing with all this. She's not reacting to the Stephen A. Smiths of the world or the Pat McAfees. She's just silently going about her business. The best thing she can do is to become an elite WNBA player. As for whether or not she's ever going to get the respect of other WNBA players, or she already has that respect, I have no idea. Is this how the WNBA usually is? I don't know, because I, like many, have not been paying attention year in and year out to what goes on in the WNBA. What I will say is it seems like that you now have a star who is bigger than your basketball league. 33% of their television ratings this year have been on games played by Caitlin Clark. That's a pretty big deal. So if you want this league to grow and to develop, you should use Caitlin Clark. You should grow her into a superstar player. I'm not saying that means that every player in that league needs to be her best friend. I'm not saying any of that. But the last thing I want to talk about is Caitlin Clark, when that's the only thing anyone wants to talk about, is a ridiculous take to have. The Reese versus Clark thing at first was really interesting, but now I think that's come to a turning point where it's just awkward and weird, and what are we talking about? Like, why are you denying the fact that people are more interested in her as a player than you as a player? Like, that's just so awkward and clunky to talk about. Like, I think that's where we're at. It's way too early in her career to be having the kinds of conversations we're having around Caitlin Clark. She is still just a rookie basketball player. She is a phenom in that a lot of people want to watch her play the game of basketball, but that is a good thing. That is not a negative thing. This is my big concern for the sport moving forward when it comes to Caitlin Clark. All of these people, Bomani Jones, Stephen A. Smith, Pat McAfee, they want to have these kinds of conversations, and they have these giant platforms where people will listen to them. But when it comes time to talk about basketball, when all we can talk about Caitlin Clark is how good she is at basketball, they'll all become silent on the topic because they're not interested in talking about how good of a basketball player she is anymore. They are using her as a hot button issue, and that's all they're interested in using her as. Again, I just think the Monica McNutts and the Andrea Carters who want to have these great conversations are having them with the wrong people. They're having them with Stephen A. Smith, and that's not their fault. It's their employer's fault. It's ESPN for putting them on First Take to have these conversations with Stephen A. Smith. Monica McNutt was 1,000% correct when she said that Stephen A. Smith could have been talking about the WNBA for years now, and he hasn't. And his whole ridiculous rant about how he's talked about women's sports more than anyone else is beyond ludicrous. I've watched First Take for years now. You having a 5-minute conversation maybe about a female athlete does not make you a hero or an icon of women's sports. And again, if Stephen A. Smith wanted to have a real conversation about it, he would have said, "You're right, I haven't talked about this topic as much as I should have, or as much as I'm giving myself credit for, and now all of a sudden I'm acting like an expert," because that's what she was calling him out on. Oh, now all of a sudden you want to talk about the WNBA because Caitlin Clark is playing in the WNBA and everyone is talking about Caitlin Clark. But instead of saying you're right, he turned it on them and said, no, you're wrong, and in fact, I'm giving myself even more credit than I'm already giving myself. That conversation told me everything I needed to know about how Stephen A. Smith feels about Caitlin Clark and the WNBA. He doesn't care about them. He's just trying to grow and build his platform at ESPN, and beyond that, he wants to be bigger than ESPN, and this is another way he's trying to do that. And I know this podcast is full of a lot of Stephen A. Smith slander, and I don't really care for who he is right now, but there was a point in time where I really did respect the man. I thought he was a legitimate journalist at some point, but now he just is interested in being the loudest voice in the room, and sadly, he's becoming the loudest voice in the room about this conversation that he has no real thoughtful insights on. He is just looking at Caitlin Clark as another 5 to 10 minute segment where he can get yelled at and yell at someone else. That's all he views it as just another topic. I do want to talk a little bit about Caitlin Clark not making Team USA because I did love her response. This is what Clark texted her coach. Hey, coach, they woke a monster. Like, I love that response. She is going to use this as a slight. That is what the best athletes do. They look at this, no matter if it is a real slight or not, and they go, I'm going to use this as motivation to become a better basketball player. And nobody is talking about this aspect of that Caitlin Clark is going to use these conversations about her to become better at the game of basketball. Because again, the people having these conversations corporations are not interested in her career as a basketball player. And I bet 10 years from now, when she is viewed as one of the best players in the world in the WNBA, she is going to give her take on everything that's happened here so far, and it is going to be fascinating to get her side of the story. I just love the fact that she is keeping things to herself and making it all about basketball, because that is what it should be at this point for a rookie basketball player. It should be about the game, not about how people perceive you, not about how if you're the face of a league you just joined. It should just be about you becoming a better player. So a word that has come up a lot in these conversations around Caitlin Clark and her relationship with the WNBA is the word jealous. And people asking the question, are other female basketball players jealous of Caitlin Clark? And I think it's important to know this. Being a fan of Clark is not a diss towards Diana Taurasi or Candace Parker or any other great female player. And I get the response from them being annoyed that some are acting like women's basketball begins and ends with Caitlin Clark. That can be an annoying feeling, especially when there have been other great female basketball players. But at the same time, can any of them look at this situation and say that this isn't Caitlin Clark's fault? Like, she's not doing anything other than being good at basketball to garner this attention that she's getting. And this is also an opportunity to grow the sport beyond Caitlin Clark. Like, I think a worst case scenario for the WNBA is we only talk about it during the Caitlin Clark era. No, you should use Caitlin Clark to grow the sport outside of her and become a league that more and more people watch, to get those ratings, to make it so people don't just watch games that she's playing in. I'm not in love with how the WNBA is treating Caitlin Clark, but I'm willing to give that league a chance to turn this person into a superstar. I'm willing to give them a few years before I give them a final grade on how they're developing Caitlin Clark into a superstar basketball player. But I just want to reiterate this. Stars are how you develop leagues. There was a time where the NBA was on tape delay, and then all of a sudden they had two massive stars that came out of college, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, and they developed that rivalry into the NBA that we know today. Can the WNBA do that with Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark? I mean, that's the best case scenario, that both of them become Hall of Fame players that meet up in the WNBA finals, and that becomes a real basketball rivalry, and a rivalry that's built towards them facing off in basketball games. Not internet conjecture, not conversations on ESPN First Take, but about the actual game of basketball. That's how the league is going to grow and develop, is if these two become rivals on the court, not off of it, not conversations on ESPN, Fox Sports, or what other platform. It needs to be about the game of basketball. Caitlin Clark needs to help grow the game of basketball, and the WNBA needs to help her with that, with the marketing. And the same for Angel Reese. I mean, turn this into a rivalry on the court. I mean, could you imagine what the ratings would be if these two met in the WNBA finals? That should be what the league is going after. Not all of the talk online, not social media, because social media is not the place to have these kinds of conversations. It's a basketball league. We need to start talking about the basketball of it all. I also think now is a time for this league to look to move forward, and moving forward is with Caitlin Clark being at the helm of it. I've known of other female basketball players, Candace Parker, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird. I know that they were really good at basketball, but now's not the time to live in the past and talk about them and compare them towards Caitlin Clark. Now is the time to build your sport to a point where it can become a rating success story. Listen, I've said everything I've needed to say about this topic. I was avoiding it for a while because I don't know if there's a whole lot for me to say. I don't follow the WNBA on a regular basis. I am rooting for Caitlin Clark to be one of the major faces of sports moving forward. Like, I love what she does with the free-point shooting. That's what Steph Curry did for the NBA, and that can lead to massive popularity. I just wish the coverage around her was a lot better. Again, you can hear this this podcast, I'm really bothered by the Stephen A. Smiths of the world using her as just another launching point to give their takes on issues that have nothing to do with Caitlin Clark as a basketball player. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.